When two of the greatest strategy games ever made combine, I become a very happy man. My name is Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman, and welcome back to the channel. Hello everyone! Today's video is a very special one as we are talking about Guild Saga Vanished Worlds, a new indie turn-based strategy RPG from Ocelot Technologies. Not only is Guild Saga a very interesting take on the genre that has immediately grabbed my attention, but I'm also pleased to announce that this video itself is sponsored by Ocelot Technologies and Vicarious PR. This is the first of hopefully many sponsored videos on the channel, so thank you very much to Ocelot and Vicarious for granting me this opportunity. Do note that, despite this being a sponsored video, all views contained herein are my own. That goes for the praise and the critiques I'm going to provide. If you're interested in Guild Saga by the end of the video, all I ask is that you go and wishlist it on Steam. If you're watching on release, it's a featured part of Steam Next Fest, and you can find a demo of the game there as well to try it out for yourself. And hey, if you're new here and you found a new game to potentially enjoy because of this video, maybe like the video and subscribe before you go. It's free, after all, and it would help me out a ton. Thank you. The story of Guild Saga takes place on the continent of Ard, and you start off as a newly minted adventurer on a boat. You're being sent to the new world because there's adventure and riches and fame and glory, and also apparently God's favorite steed was killed by someone who shot an arrow from the new world, and like maybe we need to check that out. Why they sent 3 newly minted adventurers to go do it is a different question that your player characters are going to wind up bringing up, but I mean still, adventure, right? Now, I mentioned at the top of the video that there are 2 strategy games that I consider to be titans of the genre that I feel Guild Saga clearly draws inspiration from. What are those 2 games? Well, one is the classic CRPG Divinity Original Sin 2, the title that came from Larian Studios prior to them releasing Baldur's Gate 3, and then either Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre, take your pick, the granddaddies of the turn-based, grid-based strategy gameplay genre. You know them, you love them, we all love them. When you first get dropped into the character creator, you can immediately start to see the inspiration that's drawn from CRPGs like Divinity as you start to build your character. The game has an action point economy, elemental weaknesses and resistances, terrain effects, character creation, equipment systems, all of which are very familiar to anyone who has played a Larian Studios game. However, Guild Saga also clearly takes inspiration from the tactics genre, my personal favorite, things like Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Ogre Reborn, Fire Emblem, with battles taking place on static battlefields, grid-based. You have to move your units around in order and make the best use that you can of the terrain to navigate around enemies, maximize your own strategic effectiveness. It's a very fun combination, and while it definitely rings the most of Divinity Original Sin 2 to me, there's enough tactics in there that it feels like a really nice, fresh blending of styles that immediately, again, made me very intrigued in the game. For this video, I had the opportunity to play the first 3 hours of Guild Saga. Starting off, because I'm me, I decided to make a combination of a ranger and a necromancer. You know, being an archer in real life, I have a particular affinity for archery and bows, and anyone who knows me and knows the channel, that necromancy is kind of one of my favorite things in fantasy, so putting the 2 together seemed like a natural choice. The skills I chose allowed me to fluidly jump around the battlefield, suppress enemies with ranged high-damage stuns, and most importantly, summon skeleton warriors that I could utilize as either frontline shock troopers or defensive walls to protect me and the rest of my party's backline. What's exciting about Guild Saga is the fact that you can really kind of blend your character however you want. You have fairly standard fantasy fare, your fire magic, wind magic, water, etc., etc., things like necromancy, all that type of good stuff, healing magic, but then you can also combine all of those with sword and board melee combat, or dual wielding daggers assassination gameplay, or ranged fighting with a bow, all this different type of stuff. And just because you want to be a sword and board knight doesn't mean you're forbidden from using magic, from being a paladin with healing magic, or maybe a wind mage who empowers their blade with wind magic, something we'll see with one of the party members coming up. It's awesome that you can go in and from the jump, before you've even entered the game itself, craft a completely unique player character with a setup that works basically however you want it to. Will there be more and less optimal ways to play? Of course, there always are in strategy games. But just the fact that you're not stuck as a dude with a sword and a wooden plank shield and some leather armor who has one ability other than hitting something with his sword, and that's a tackle that knocks a unit back, is very refreshing. It's really nice knowing that from the jump, you can set up your campaign to play however you want. every party member can be leveled however you want. And while they do come in with a sort of base set of skills that guide what they're going to be doing from the moment you get them, and it is unclear if you're going to have the ability to respec units throughout the game. I'm assuming you will, pretty standard in this type of game, but I don't actually know one way or the other. You can still then choose to develop them down whatever paths you want. There are 2 party members that you can use in the demo that I played: Lucite, a magical swordsman, and Asuka, a druid. And what's interesting is they both have the ability with their base skills to go off in a couple different directions right from the jump. Lucite can be a mage, a swordsman, or a spell sword, whereas Asuka can be a ranger or a druid. Using Lucite as a spell sword allows him to tank and deal damage on the front line as a sword and board knight, while still having ranged capabilities and the ability to deal magical damage thanks to his spells. Things like lightning bolts and thunderclouds to hit enemies from range, stun them, suppress them, and then actually infusing his weapon with magical damage is vital because enemies in this game have 2 types of armor, physical and magical, and getting through them requires different types of damage. On Asuka, I decided to spec fully into her magical capabilities, even though she has dual daggers and a bow, just to see how far I could push her damage output and how much utility she would bring to the team. As such, she was throwing a lot of clods of stone around as primarily a geomancer, casting fireballs and wind magic for ranged damage in lines, and having the ability to put down traps, summon companions, all that type of good stuff, heal my allies. It was very, very useful, and she was very versatile for by the end of the demo, level 4 mage. There was a lot that she was able to do, and part of that was due to the equipment that she had, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Combined with my ability to deal primarily physical damage and suppress the enemy, I was able to handle pretty much any combat encounter I ran into in my time with Guild Saga with very little issue. There was a couple times where things got a little sketch, but largely I had a good setup going, and I'm curious as to how switching things around, having a different type of main character, or maybe having Lucite and Asuka could go down different paths in their potential skill trees would change things up, because it felt great to play from the way I was playing, and I know that there's going to be a lot of different ways that people choose to approach the game. One skill I found was the Vampirism skill, a melee range ability that allowed me to drain health off of my enemies and add it to my own total health pool, you know, a normal life drain effect like you would expect to see in a strategy game like this. And it's funny because while it is absolutely my flavor of magic, and it did fall into the warlock necromancy spell school that I was playing with my main character, I never actually felt the need to use it because I was never in melee range, taking hits or dealing damage. I was always jumping away, shooting things with my bow, summoning my skeleton warriors to take hits for me. So even though it was in the school of magic that I was using, I still didn't feel the need for it. So it shows how deeply you're going to be able to customize characters based on even what type of warlock or necromancer they are, not just that they're in that school, which is fun. Of course, the efficacy of the spell or the skill that you're using is directly tied to your level in that spell's school of magic or martial ability. So making sure that you're actually focusing into the stats and the skills for the type of spells that you want to use is vital. Shouldn't need to be said, but when you've got this level of customization at hand, you want to have some focus. A jack of all stats I don't think is going to perform particularly well here. As I mentioned, there are 2 types of armor in the game, as well as your HP, physical and magical armor, and being able to punch through them is vital because it's the only way that you're going to actually be able to put status effects or poison, damage over time effects, things like that on your enemies. If they have armor, if they have magic armor, they're going to largely resist most effects. So you need to play around knowing when your units are going to be going, what abilities they're going to have off cooldown or just available to them in general, and then what type of armor it is that they'll be targeting so you can set up the order of operations properly to maximize the effectiveness of your skills. For me, this meant that I actually had a little bit of a hard time sometimes getting through opponents' magical armor when I needed to, since my main character really was not dealing any magic damage at all, and I was primarily using Lucite on the front line hitting things with his sword. So while he was dealing some magic damage with his wind-infused blade, it wasn't a ton. That often left Asuka in a situation where she was not able to deal HP damage when I needed her to try and finish off enemies because she was still hitting their magic armor. Now, does this mean that you should spec entirely into one type of damage so you can get through to an enemy's HP and potentially start applying status effects faster? I don't think so, because you're going to encounter times where there's an enemy who's just far more proficient in one type of armor over the other, and if it happens to be the one that you're spec'd into dealing with, you're going to have a really hard time getting through it to actually actually hurt them. So having that diversity of damage is going to be key. It's just going to be a matter of balancing it throughout your party a little bit better than I did in my time with the game. Part of this as well is managing your action point economy. This is something that you should be familiar with if you played, again, games like Divinity or the original Fallout games. But if you haven't experienced those types of titles, those types of maybe CRPG style games, it might not be something that you're familiar with. So we'll talk about it here. The way the action point economy works in Guild Saga is you start with 3 a turn, and you can hold up to a max of 5. Any that you don't use by the end of your turn will then carry over into your next turn, and that's important because not only will it mean that you can kind of save up and quote-unquote ramp into a bigger turn if you get a bunch of action points, but some abilities like my Summon Skeleton Warrior require 4 action points, so you can't just pop it right at the start of a battle. As such, my go-to turn order was typically to either jump to a vantage point with my jump ability or shoot an enemy that happened to be in range once. Either of these abilities would only use 1 point, and then on my next turn, I would have the 4 points that I would need to summon my Skeleton Warrior pet to tank hits, deal extra damage, all that type of good stuff. Combined with Asuka's ability to lay traps, a skill that I gave her via a spellbook I found, since we talked about that earlier, I had pretty good control of the battlefield, which was absolutely vital due to the way that Guild Saga handles the transition from open world exploration to turn-based, grid-based combat. When you encounter a battle, the game transitions seamlessly into a traditional grid-based combat system using the exact terrain that you were previously moving through. And thanks to the fact that you have a free cam, you can actually scout out battles before you trigger them by looking ahead on the map, giving you the chance to form a loose battle plan before you get stuck in. Thanks to that grid-based system of movement, ways to control the battlefield, like again with Skeleton Warriors and traps, is absolutely vital. Even more so because units can't actually pass through each other, even if they're allies. As such, careful positioning and making sure that you're not tripping yourself up and getting in your way with your own traps or your own units is very important. And having a move point or 2 saved so you can move into position, take a ranged shot with one of your backline, and then move out of the way so someone else can step into that spot and also take a shot on their turn, wound up being something that I found myself planning for a lot, and it helped significantly. This is doubly so due to the fact that a lot of ranged attacks actually follow very strict lines of sight. You can't just fire a bow off at an angle, you have to be directly lined up with an enemy. Similarly to how certain ranged weapons work in the Disgaea series if you've played that. It rewards you for paying attention to where you're going and what you're doing instead of just throwing your units around and hoping for the best. This is before we even consider the fact that there are a variety of different terrains and as such terrain effects that you need to pay attention to as well. Because of all this, careful planning and movement is absolutely vital. Hovering just out of reach of enemies, ensuring you have clear lines of fire for ranged attacks, knowing when to push forward or retreat are all a must. And my time with Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre made me feel right at home in Guild Saga. Exploring the world of Ard is refreshingly simple. You can trek through caves and jungles, searching for bodies or crates with items to loot, and it was very quick and smooth gameplay. And while the paths that I was going down were mostly linear with a couple branching options that wound up ending at the same location, I did encounter some hidden areas and treasure caches that rewarded me for staying on my toes and paying attention as I explored. Speaking of treasure, there is a ton of loot to find in the game, from everything as basic as food items for healing and bones and string for crafting to legendary pieces of armor and weaponry that dramatically changed the way that my characters played. Following an old pirate's treasure map, I actually found a new staff for Asuka that gave her access to a variety of different elemental abilities beyond just her basic geomancy. And while she wasn't as proficient damage-wise with them because she hadn't spec'd into those skills, it was very important that I have that access because enemies do have different elemental resistances and weaknesses. So having my main spellcaster being able to say, well, do I want to hit this guy with earth, fire, water, ice, or wind was super useful. Just like looking at an enemy and seeing, oh, they have a minus 20% weakness to fire. Well, it's a good thing Asuka can suddenly throw around fireballs, isn't it? And away she would go, and it was great. You can find shields, weapons, helms, trinkets, rings, belts, a whole bevy of different options. And I mean, I just found some good stuff in the first few hours of playing the game. I can only imagine what some of the crazy builds you'll be able to put together with legendary gear will be by the end of it. You can also find notes, pieces of lore, books with a lot of world building, or, treasure maps, things that grant you new quests or hints about quests that you're currently on. It felt really, really good to just walk around the world and see what it was that I could find. pulling honey out of a beehive that I could feed to one of my characters in battle to heal them up, or stumbling across an old battlefield with a bunch of corpses strewn around and some monsters picking at their bones that I was then able to slay, get useful crafting parts off of the monsters, and then also take gold and gear off the bodies was awesome. I mean, this is classic CRPG stuff, and being able to do it in the combat shell of a strategy RPG made me giddy. I absolutely loved it. Running around and talking with NPCs was similarly satisfying. They have honestly a lot of fun and funny dialogue, and there were a number of very interesting tidbits about the story of the world that we'll get into in a little bit here. Some of my favorite moments were little side quests that we encountered, though. At one point, I earned the aid of a pirate because I agreed that, yeah, the things that your crew were doing were pretty messed up, and I'm glad that you want out and you're regretful of your actions and everything, but maybe you should show how regretful you are by helping me to take down your old crew. And he did. He didn't join my team, but he did show up for the boss fight. I kept him alive throughout. And while, again, he didn't join afterwards, the dialogue hinted that we may wind up running into him in the future, so I'm hoping maybe he will become a party member, or maybe there'll be another quest down the line where we can help him out with something, get a cool reward. And that's awesome, because, I mean, I could have just not talked to him, I could have not earned his favor, or I could have not kept him alive during the battle. If any of those things had occurred, that's an entire potential side quest with an NPC that I just never even would have known about, but now I've got something to look forward to for when I move into the full game, and that's very, very exciting. I love to see through lines like that, the game actually paying attention to what it has going on and rewarding the player for paying attention as well, and seeing that in an indie game like this, it's very satisfying. It's the type of thing that you don't always expect to see from smaller projects like this, and knowing that it's in Guild Saga gives me a lot of hope for the future of the game. The best moment for me, though, and something I want to talk about at greater length, was solving the case of an attempted murder between two married mimic chests, which was not something I was expecting to encounter in any game that I had played, from Baldur's Gate to this. And yet here it is, and I absolutely adored it. And I adore it because the writing in Guild Saga is genuinely funny and endearing a lot of the time, with highlights as big as the Pantheon of the Gods or as small as side quest drama being engaging in a way that many games, big and small, fail to be. Without getting into anything too spoilery, I'm very, very curious as to what exactly is going on in the story of Guild Saga, with implications that the God of Light may be lashing out at the world due to the mysterious death of his beloved steed at seemingly mortal hands. And again, the previously mentioned mimic chest domestic was really cute and funny. After all, who's ever heard of an attempted murder via drunken drowning between two sentient treasure chests? Not me, until I played Guild Saga. There's also contextual dialogue based on your chosen race and class, such as a devil-cursed merchant in the camp that you start in, recognizing me as a fellow devil, as it's the race that I chose at the start of the game, because I figured it was cool and edgy, and that's what I was going for as my ranger necromancer, right? And it actually triggered some extra dialogue about the devil curse and how both characters would like to cure it, and the impact that it's had on our lives as normal people who had this affliction suddenly develop in them. I never would have known about that. Like, I just picked it because it looked cool. I was like, all right, well, this seems like a fun race to choose rather than like a normal human or an elf or whatever. And then boom, immediately I ran into some dialogue that you might not ever hear otherwise because I had picked that race. Super cool. I love that. Very good attention to detail. Graphically as well, the game is quite pleasing to look at. It's got nice pixel graphics that stand out from its contemporaries, and the animations, especially cutscene animations, are really, like, surprisingly impactful. I'm thinking in particular of a boss whose death animation involved her magic running wild, getting encased in ice and then shattering horribly, or even a group of paladins and clerics who you meet in a dream sequence who are getting absolutely eviscerated by a group of demons. It's surprisingly fluid and high quality, and has a certain level of brutality that really drives home how nasty some of the events that could happen in a proper swords and sorcery setting can be. Really, it made me nostalgic for the good old days of pixel animation, like the PS1 era, without looking like a PS1 game, right? Without looking dated. And that's important. It's something that a lot of indie games do, obviously, and there might even be something to say for the sort of indie game pixel look that's become a little bit ubiquitous. But to me, I think Guild Saga stands out a little bit from that, which is nice. It has its own style, it looks modern and fresh, while still paying homage to those good old days, and I love that. The music is also catchy and energetic, lending energy to battles and exploration. There's only a few tracks that I heard over the course of the demo, but from what I understand, there are a lot more in the full game, and if they're all at the same quality as what we heard in the demo, then I think they're absolutely going to be enjoyable throughout. And overall, all these different disparate parts have come together in a way that I really wasn't expecting, that made Guild Saga really compelling to play. Like, I was legitimately extremely sad when I ran up on the end of the demo and realized there wasn't anything more. I wanted to continue exploring, I wanted to find more loot, keep leveling up my characters, speccing into more abilities, seeing what new skills and spells I'd acquire, where some of these side quests were going, where the story is going. It immediately drew me in, and that isn't always easy to do. There's absolutely been times where I start a new game, an indie game, AAA game, whatever. It's like, man, where's this going? Yeah, I've seen this combat before. I've seen these story beats before. I know what these characters are going to be like. And I didn't get that feeling from Guild Saga, and that's a very good sign. Now, that said, I do have a couple of critiques that I want to talk about really quick. First off, the controls can be slightly frustrating at times. I was playing with mouse and keyboard, and there were times that either keys were not mapped in the way that I would have expected or would have liked, or times where there were just slight delays that were frustrating. I'd like to be able to click on a chest or an item in the world to loot it rather than having to hit E to do so. I'd also like to be able to close open windows like enemy stat screens with the escape key instead of having to actually course over with my mouse and click the X to close it every time. The delays that I mentioned when using certain abilities and spells between when the first animation ends and when you're allowed to cast again can sometimes feel inconsistent and frustrating, and while very minor, it did lead to me clicking back and forth between my spell and target a few times, trying to get the ability to trigger. This wasn't an issue, it seemed, with melee attacks, where I was able to just spam through all of my action points and just keep hitting an enemy over and over until I was out of actions, whereas there was a little bit more of a delay between spells. It took me out of it a little bit. But that said, the framework and base of this game are there, absolutely. I highly recommend checking it out. It is going to be in early access, and I'm absolutely going to be keeping my eye on it as it develops, as I really enjoyed what I saw thus far. But what are your thoughts? Is this interesting to you? Do you want to see or play a blending of isometric CRPG and grid-based combat strategy RPG? Because again, I know I do now. I didn't realize that I did before, but I definitely do now. How's the game look to you? Are you going to check it out? Again, if you're watching at release, it's at Steam Next Fest. You can go on Steam right now, download the demo, check it out for yourself. And if you do, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Like I said, this is one that I'm absolutely going to be keeping my eye on, and if it's something that you guys would like to see on the channel going forward during release, or maybe once the game enters full release, let me know, and I'd be happy to check it out if the schedule allows. If not, I'm absolutely going to be checking it out in my own time as well, because again, I think there's a lot of possibility here, and Ocelot Technologies could absolutely have something very special on their hands. Thank you once again to Ocelot and Vicarious for sponsoring the video. It absolutely means the world, and thank you all for watching. My name has been Tom, otherwise known as Titanium Legman. I hope you all have a good night. Stay safe and healthy out there, and remember, be good to each other. Bye now.